knew about my family. My name is Hannah Collins, and for most of my life, I was the invisible daughter. Whenever something wonderful happened to my older sister, Emily, my parents celebrated like the whole world needed to know about it. When she graduated from college, they rented a banquet hall and invited half the town. When she bought her first house, my father helped with the down payment. And my mother spent weeks decorating the guest rooms as if Emily had won the lottery. When I graduated with honors and accepted a teaching position at the local elementary school, my mother smiled politely and said, "That's nice, sweetheart. But have you thought about finding a career that actually pays well? Maybe it sounds dramatic to say I grew up in my sister's shadow, but at least a shadow proves someone notices you exist. Most of the time, I felt more like a ghost living inside someone else's family." At the funeral, hundreds of powerful people came to pay their respects. Politicians, business leaders, charity directors, men and women in expensive black suits lined up to talk about his generosity and brilliance. But I couldn't stop noticing something strange. Every time someone mentioned the upcoming reading of the will, Emily leaned over and whispered something to my father. I can't explain why, but she didn't seem sad to me. The more I watched the two of them, the more I felt like they were waiting for good news. 3 days later, our family gathered in the office of Grandpa's attorney, the lawyer, a quiet older woman named Margaret Ellis, whom I had met a few times over the years, greeted us politely before placing several thick folders on the conference table. "As you know," she began, "Mr. Richard Collins left very detailed instructions regarding the distribution of his estate." I noticed Emily sit up a little straighter. My father reached over and took my mother's hand. Honestly, I barely cared. I assumed Grandpa had donated most of his fortune to charities and scholarship funds, and I knew he had always planned to leave the business to his executives and legal trusts. The lawyer spent several minutes reading through documents, assigning gifts to charities, employees, and distant relatives. Then she suddenly stopped. "There is one final matter concerning Miss Hannah Collins." Every person in the room turned to look at me. Margaret picked up a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in my grandfather's unmistakable handwriting. "He instructed me to give this to you personally," she said, "and to ask you one question after you've read it." My hands were shaking as I opened the envelope. Inside was a single handwritten letter. "My dearest Hannah, if you're reading this, I'm gone. And I hope you know how proud I've always been of you. There is something I never told you, because I wanted to see what kind of person you would become without expecting rewards. For the last 6 years, I have instructed my office to send you a cashier's check for $7,000 on the first day of every month. It was never meant to make you rich. It was meant to make sure you never had to choose between paying bills and chasing your dreams. What I cannot understand is why you never deposited a single one." The room went completely silent. I looked up from the page, unable to understand what I had just read. "What is this?" I whispered. I watched Margaret slowly open a file in front of her. "Mr. Collins asked me to verify whether you had been receiving the payments," she said quietly. "According to our records, every monthly check was mailed, and every single one of them was endorsed and cashed. The only person who ever made me feel seen was my grandfather. Most people knew him as Richard Collins, the billionaire real estate developer who had built half the downtown skyline. I had read newspaper articles calling him a visionary, and I'd heard business people describe him as ruthless. But none of that was the man I knew. To me, he was simply Grandpa Richard, the old man who wore expensive suits, but wasn't afraid to sit on the porch with me, eating vanilla ice cream straight from the carton. He never treated me like I was less important than Emily. In fact, I always had the feeling that he noticed the little things nobody else ever saw. When I was 12 years old, I entered a county art competition and won second place. My parents forgot to come and saw Grandpa Richard standing there. He had driven 3 hours just to surprise me. He clapped louder than anyone else in the room, and afterward he took me out for hamburgers. "You know why I came?" he asked as we sat in the little diner. I shrugged. "Because people should never miss the moments that shape a person's heart," he said. "The world celebrates success. Very few people celebrate effort." I never forgot those words. As I got older, I started to understand why my grandfather and the rest of the family never really got along. My parents loved his money, but they hated his rules. Grandpa Richard believed that everyone should earn their own future. He had paid for both Emily and me to go to college, but after graduation, he refused to hand out endless gifts or rescue people from their own bad decisions. My parents complained about it constantly. "He has more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. My father would grumble. "What's the point of having all that money if he won't help his own family?" Grandpa would just laugh. "I already helped my family," he'd say. "I gave them opportunities. What they do with them after that is their responsibility." Emily never liked hearing that. To everyone else, she was charming and beautiful. But I had spent my whole life watching her use those gifts to get exactly what she wanted. If she wanted a new car, she somehow convinced my parents she deserved one because all her friends had nicer vehicles. If she maxed out her credit cards, she always found a way to make it someone else's fault for not supporting her enough. And somehow, no matter what happened, I always watched her walk away with exactly what she wanted. By the time I turned 31, my own life looked nothing like the future I had imagined. I was divorced after a short and painful marriage, drowning in student loans, and renting a tiny apartment above an old hardware store. Every time it rained, water dripped through the ceiling into a bucket I kept by the window. Most weekends I took tutoring jobs just to make sure I could keep up with rent and bills. Emily, meanwhile, lived in a 5-bedroom house she couldn't actually afford, drove a luxury SUV, and filled social media with pictures of designer handbags and expensive vacations. My parents constantly reminded me of the difference between us. "Maybe if you were more ambitious," my mother liked to say, "you'd have what your sister has." I wanted to tell her the truth, that Emily's entire lifestyle was built on borrowed money, unpaid credit cards, and endless favors, but I had learned a long time ago that arguing never changed anything. The only person who ever seemed to understand was Grandpa Richard. About once a month, he invited me to lunch at a small family-owned diner on the other side of town. He hated expensive restaurants. He used to joke that they charged $50 to serve food that tasted worse than a grilled cheese sandwich. One rainy afternoon, he looked across the table at me and asked, "Tell me honestly, Hannah, are you happy?" I stared down at my coffee cup. "I don't know." That's not an answer. I was quiet for a long moment before I finally admitted the truth. I think I got tired of trying to prove that I matter. I'll never forget the look on his face. It hardened in a way I had never seen before. "Who made you believe you had to prove that?" I laughed quietly and shrugged. "You've met my family." He didn't laugh with me. Instead, he reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "One day, you'll understand something they never will," he said softly. "Character outlives money, kindness outlives beauty, and the people who quietly keep going when nobody is cheering, they're the ones worth betting on." Those ended up being the last words of advice he ever gave me. 3 months later, he suffered a massive heart attack. I got the call while I was teaching a reading lesson to a classroom full of second graders. By the time I reached the hospital, my parents and Emily were already there. My mother was crying. My father kept rubbing his hands together, and I couldn't remember ever seeing him look that nervous. But Emily, she didn't look heartbroken at all. If anything, she looked impatient, like she was waiting for something. The doctors told us Grandpa was unconscious and might never wake up. I sat beside his bed for hours, holding his hand and thinking about every little kindness he had ever shown me. The birthday cards that always arrived on time when nobody else remembered. The handwritten notes he mailed after every accomplishment. The stories he used to tell me about sleeping in his truck while he built his business from nothing. He passed away just before sunrise. I felt the blood drain from my face. I never got any checks. I saw the lawyer frown. That's impossible. Before I could say another word, I heard a chair scrape loudly across the floor. I turned my head just in time to see Emily jump to her feet so quickly that her purse slipped from her shoulder and crashed onto the ground. For a second, nobody in the room moved. Then I looked at my sister's face, and for the first time in my entire life, I realized she was terrified. I looked up from the letter and felt my stomach drop. The color had drained completely from Emily's face. For a brief second, nobody in the room moved. My father was staring at her with a confused expression, and I watched my mother reach for her arm. "Emily? What's wrong?" She forced out a nervous laugh. "Nothing. Why would anything be wrong?" But I wasn't the only one who noticed. Margaret Ellis lowered her eyes to the papers in front of her and studied Emily for a moment. She had spent decades handling complicated estates and family disputes, and the look on her face told me she recognized panic when she saw it. I slowly turned toward my mother. "You knew the checks were coming?" She stared back at me without saying a word. Then I saw the confusion disappear from her face, replaced by something that looked a lot like fear. I don't know what she's talking about." Margaret opened another folder. "I have copies of the certified mail receipts. Someone signed for every envelope." She slid them across the table. My mother's hand began to tremble. There, at the bottom of every receipt was a signature. Linda Collins, my mother's signature. She covered her mouth. "I only signed because Emily told me they were business papers from your grandfather's office." I looked at Emily, but she refused to meet my eyes. As I stared at the papers spread across the table, the truth slowly started coming together in my mind, and somehow it hurt even more than I could have imagined. My own sister had taken the money, and my own mother had helped her do it. Whether she understood what was happening or not, Margaret cleared her throat. "There is one more. Instruction from Mr. Collins." She unlocked a small black case and removed a flash drive. He requested that, if Hannah denied receiving the payments, this recording be played in front of the entire family. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Emily take a step backward. "No." Margaret looked up. "I'm sorry?" "No," Emily snapped. "You can't play private recordings." "This is ridiculous." "It is perfectly legal," Margaret replied. "Mr. Collins recorded it in my presence." She connected the drive to a small television mounted on the wall. The screen flickered to life. Then my grandfather appeared. He looked older than I remembered. Tired, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. "If you're watching this," he began, "then Hannah has told Margaret she never received the money I sent her." I felt tears welling up instantly. Hearing his voice again after the funeral was almost unbearable. He smiled gently at the camera. "My dear girl, if that's true, then someone I trusted has betrayed both of us." The room was completely still. I started sending Hannah $7,000 a month because I knew she would never ask for help. Pride runs in the Collins family, but hers comes from dignity, not greed. His expression darkened. I suspected after the second year that something wasn't right. Hannah kept working 2 jobs. She sold her car. She moved into a cheaper apartment. None of that made sense. I couldn't stop staring at the screen. 1,000 memories rushed through my mind all at once. He knew, somehow, all those years, he had known something was wrong. So I hired a private investigator. Out of the corner of my eye, I watched Emily grab the back of a chair with both hands. For a second, she looked like she might collapse. Emily looked around the room desperately. "You have to help me." Nobody answered. She turned to my mother. "Mom?" My mother took a small step away from her. Then she looked at my father. "Dad, say something." When I looked at my father, I saw tears gathering in his eyes for the first time that I could remember. "I spent 35 years defending you," he whispered. "I told everyone Hannah was too sensitive. I told myself we treated you both fairly." Then he looked at me. "I was wrong." Those 3 words hurt more than all the years of neglect, because they had come 20 years too late. I could barely get the words out. "It says, Grandpa didn't just know Emily was stealing from me." I slowly turned toward my mother. The color had drained from her face, and she lowered her eyes before they could meet mine. "It says he discovered someone else had been helping her from the very beginning." I looked back down at the letter. And according to him, it wasn't my father. For a long moment, nobody said a word. Something inside me broke as I stood there holding that letter. I realized the biggest betrayal in my family had never really been about money. Whatever my grandfather had discovered, it had been hidden for decades. And somehow, my mother had been carrying that secret all along. I looked up from the letter and saw my mother's hands begin to shake. My father's eyes moved from me to her, and I had never seen him look so completely confused. "What does that mean?" he asked quietly. "Linda, what is she talking about?" I couldn't answer him. I was still staring at the letter in my grandfather's handwriting. There were only a few sentences on the page, but they carried the weight of an entire lifetime. "Hannah, if you are reading this, then the truth has finally come out." I hoped I was wrong, but the evidence became impossible to ignore. Emily did not act alone. Someone inside the family protected her every step of the way. I discovered that your mother knew about the checks much earlier than she claims. I also discovered another secret she has carried for over 30 years. I will leave it to her to tell you. If she refuses, Margaret has the documents. I lowered the letter slowly. The room was so quiet that I could hear the ticking of the old wall clock. My father looked at my mother. "Linda, what documents?" She didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on the floor. "Tell me," he said again, louder this time. Still nothing. Margaret Ellis reached into her briefcase and removed a thin, sealed envelope. "I hope this wouldn't be necessary," she said softly. "Mr. Collins instructed me to give Mrs. Collins the opportunity to tell the truth herself." She placed the envelope on the table. My mother stared at it as though it might explode. Father picked it up before she could stop him. "What is this?" "Evidence," Margaret replied. He opened it. Inside were copies of bank statements, certified mail receipts, and several printed emails. At the very bottom was a notarized statement from the private investigator my grandfather had hired. I watched my father's expression change as he read through the papers. The color slowly disappeared from his face, and when he finally looked up, his voice was barely more than a whisper. "You knew." My mother finally broke. She covered her face and started crying. "I never wanted it to go this far." "You knew Emily was stealing from Hannah?" She nodded weakly. Hearing those words out loud hit me harder than I ever thought it would. For years, I had convinced myself that my mother simply favored my sister, that she overlooked things because Emily was louder, more demanding, more dramatic. I had never imagined she would knowingly allow my future to be stolen. "When?" I asked. She looked at me through tears. "About 6 months after the check started." I felt my chest tighten. 6 months? She nodded. "I saw one of the envelopes from your grandfather's office. Emily admitted she'd opened it by mistake. Then she told me you didn't deserve the money." I laughed bitterly. "Didn't deserve it? You had Grandpa's attention, his respect. He always believed in you. Emily thought you were going to inherit everything one day, and she was terrified she'd be left with nothing." I looked toward my sister. She wasn't crying anymore. She was just sitting there, staring at the table. My mother continued. "She begged me not to tell anyone. She said she'd only take a few checks and then pay it back. She promised she'd stop. And you believed her?" My mother couldn't answer. I stood there looking at her, waiting for her to deny it. But she couldn't. And in that silence, I realized the truth. She had never really believed Emily would pay the money back. She had simply chosen to protect her, the same way she always had. My father dropped the papers onto the table. 6 years, he whispered. "You watched this happen for 6 years?" I was trying to keep the family together. The words echoed through the room. I couldn't stop myself from laughing. Not because anything was funny. Because after a lifetime of being the forgotten child, I finally understood the rules. Keeping the family together had never meant protecting everyone. It had always meant protecting Emily. "No matter who got hurt." Margaret quietly opened another file. "There is one more matter Mr. Collins wanted addressed. Nobody looked at her. He amended his will 9 months before his death. That got everyone's attention." She slid a thick legal document across the table toward me. "Your grandfather believed the stolen money should be restored to you. Since most of the original funds were spent, he created a separate trust." I frowned. "A trust?" She nodded. "He transferred a portion of his personal investments into an account under your name." Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Emily lift her head so quickly that her chair almost scraped against the floor. How much? Margaret didn't even glance at her. The current value of the trust is approximately $8 million. $400,000. The room went completely silent. My mother gasped. My father stumbled backward into his chair. Emily shot to her feet. What? Margaret continued calmly. Mr. Collins also left detailed instructions. The trust belongs solely to Hannah Collins. It cannot be challenged, divided, borrowed against, or claimed by any relative through inheritance or marriage. Emily looked at me in disbelief. No, that's impossible. It is legally binding. Her voice cracked. But Grandpa said family was everything. Margaret looked directly at her. He also wrote a personal note regarding that. She unfolded another sheet of paper and read, aloud, "Family is not defined by the people who share your blood. Family is defined by the people who protect your heart when they have the chance to break it." I couldn't hold back my tears anymore. It wasn't because of the money. It was because, for the first time in my life, I realized someone had seen everything I had spent years pretending. Didn't hurt. Emily suddenly walked around the table toward me. "Hannah, please," I looked at her. She reached for my hand. I was desperate. "I made mistakes, I whispered. "I can fix this. You stole 6 years of my life. I'll pay you back." "With what?" She didn't answer, because there was nothing left. The house was mortgaged. The luxury car was leased. The vacations, the jewelry, the designer clothes, they had all been bought with money that had been meant to give me a chance at a better future. My father stood up. "You should leave." Emily blinked. "Dad?" "You heard me." She looked at my mother. "Mom?" For a moment I thought my mother would protect her again. Instead, she closed her eyes. Then she quietly said, "Go." Emily looked around the room at all of us, and I could almost see the moment it finally sank in. For the first time in her life, nobody was stepping in to rescue her. She grabbed her purse and stormed toward the door. Halfway there, she turned around. "This is all your fault," she screamed at me. "You always had to be the favorite." Then she slammed the door behind her. The sound echoed through the office. A few seconds later, I watched my father sink into his chair and cover his face with his hands. "I failed you," he whispered. I looked at him for a long moment. When I was little, I used to imagine what it would feel like to hear him say those words. I thought they would fix something inside me, but they didn't. Some wounds are too old to disappear in a single afternoon. "I know," I said quietly. He started crying. So did my mother, but I couldn't. I had spent too many years crying alone. Margaret waited until the silence settled. "There is one last instruction from your grandfather." She handed me a small velvet box. Inside was an old silver. Key dot attached to it was a tag with a handwritten note for the cabin by the lake, the only place where nobody expected you to be anyone except yourself. I smiled through my tears. When I was little, Grandpa used to take me there every summer. We would fish from the dock, cook terrible pancakes, and stay up late talking about books and dreams. I hadn't been there in nearly 10 years. "The cabin is yours now," Margaret said, along with everything inside it. A week later, I drove there alone. The place looked exactly the way I remembered. The old wooden porch, the rocking chairs, the little wind chime hanging beside the front door. When I unlocked it, I found something waiting for me on the kitchen table sat a stack of letters. Every one of them had my name on it. There were birthday letters. Letters for the day I got married. Letters for the day I might become a mother. Letters for days when life felt impossible. And one final envelope marked, "Open this after you. Finally know your worth." I opened. It inside was a single page. "My dear Hannah, if you've reached this letter, then you finally know a truth I spent years trying to teach you. The people who overlook your kindness are not measuring your value. They are revealing their own. Never chase love that has to be earned through suffering. Never fight for a place at a table where your seat can be taken away. And never believe that being gentle means being weak. You were never the child who had less. You were the child who deserved more. Love always, Grandpa." I sat there for a long time, holding the letter against my chest. A month later, I resigned from my second job. A year later, I created the Richard Collins Scholarship Fund, using part of the trust to help students who had talent but lacked support. I restored the old cabin and turned it into a quiet retreat where teachers, social workers, and foster families could stay for free whenever they needed a place to rest. As for Emily, she eventually accepted a plea agreement after investigators traced the forged checks and fraudulent deposits. I didn't celebrate when it happened. Revenge had never really been what I wanted. What I wanted was the chance to stop feeling invisible. My parents tried many times to rebuild our relationship. Slowly and carefully, I allowed them back into small parts of my life. But I never forgot the years when they looked away, learned that forgiveness does not always mean going back to the way things were. Sometimes it simply means deciding not to carry the anger forever. On the anniversary of my grandfather's birthday, I returned to the lake cabin and sat on the old dock as the sun disappeared behind the trees. As I sat there watching the last light fade across the water, I realized I felt something I hadn't felt since I was a little girl. Not because I had inherited millions, not because the truth had finally come out, but because I finally understood that my worth had never depended on who chose me, or on who failed to. And maybe that's the hardest lesson any family can teach you. The people who truly love you will never make you compete for a place in their hearts. And the greatest inheritance anyone can leave behind isn't money. It's the courage to know your own value, even when the people closest to you never did. The day my grandfather died, I thought I had lost the only person who had ever truly believed in me. Then, 3 days later, a lawyer handed me a sealed envelope containing a single sentence that shattered everything I thought I knew about my family. My name is Hannah Collins, and for most of my life, I was the invisible daughter. Whenever something wonderful happened to my older sister, Emily, my parents celebrated like the whole world needed to know about it. When she graduated from college, they rented a banquet hall and invited half the town. When she bought her first house, my father helped with the down payment. And my mother spent weeks decorating the guest rooms as if Emily had won the lottery. When I graduated with honors and accepted a teaching position at the local elementary school, my mother smiled politely and said, "That's nice, sweetheart. But have you thought about finding a career that actually pays well?" Maybe it sounds dramatic to say I grew up in my sister's shadow, but at least a shadow proves someone notices you exist. Most of the time, I felt more like a ghost living inside someone else's family. At the funeral, hundreds of powerful people came to pay their respects. Politicians, business leaders, charity directors, men and women in expensive black suits lined up to talk about his generosity and brilliance. But I couldn't stop noticing something strange. Every time someone mentioned the upcoming reading of the will, Emily leaned over and whispered something to my father. I can't explain why, but she didn't seem sad to me. The more I watched the two of them, the more I felt like they were waiting for good news. 3 days later, our family gathered in the office of Grandpa's attorney, the lawyer, a quiet older woman named Margaret Ellis, whom I had met a few times over the years, greeted us politely before placing several thick folders on the conference table. "As you know," she began, "Mr. Richard Collins left very detailed instructions regarding the distribution of his estate." I noticed Emily sit up a little straighter. My father reached over and took my mother's hand. Honestly, I barely cared. I assumed Grandpa had donated most of his fortune to charities and scholarship funds, and I knew he had always planned to leave the business to his executives and legal trusts. The lawyer spent several minutes reading through documents, assigning gifts to charities, employees, and distant relatives. Then she suddenly stopped. "There is one final matter concerning Miss Hannah Collins." Every person in the room turned to look at me. Margaret picked up a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in my grandfather's unmistakable handwriting. "He instructed me to give this to you personally," she said, "and to ask you one question after you've read it." My hands were shaking as I opened the envelope. Inside was a single handwritten letter. "My dearest Hannah, if you're reading this, I'm gone. And I hope you know how proud I've always been of you. There is something I never told you, because I wanted to see what kind of person you would become without expecting rewards. For the last 6 years, I have instructed my office to send you a cashier's check for $7,000 on the first day of every month. It was never meant to make you rich. It was meant to make sure you never had to choose between paying bills and chasing your dreams. What I cannot understand is why you never deposited a single one." The room went completely silent. I looked up from the page, unable to understand what I had just